Okay, so we are in Parsha Rabbi, page 999, and it begins, see, I present before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing that you hearken to the commandments of Hashem your God that I command you today, and the curse if you do not hearken the commandment of Hashem your God, and you stray from the path that I command you today to follow the gods of others. So once again, so we have a blessing and a curse. We'll have a blessing, we follow the words of Hashem, and a curse, we do not. But if you look carefully at how it's presented, in verse 20 said is the blessing that you hearken to the commandments of Hashem. So the blessings are that we hearken to the blessings, whereas by the curses in verse 28, it says, if you do not hearken to the commandments of Hashem. So whereas the blessings are that's the default, the curses are an if. That means that if you don't follow the word of Hashem, you'll have the curses. So the Sfas Emes explains that this is telling us that the blessings are the default for our state in this world, is that Hashem created this world to give us blessings, and shower us with blessings. And second, yes, and that is.
I feel kind of bad because.
Give me a second. Okay, so that's the default for. 1 second. Give me 1 second. So as we were saying that the blessings are the default for how our world is going to go, whereas the curses are something that if we don't perform as we're supposed to, we're going to get the curses. Okay, so now continuing on. Oh, and another explanation that they give for this, what did I write there? Oh, okay. Let's just move on from there. And it continues that in verse 29, that it shall be that when Hashem your God brings you to the land to which you come to possess it, then you shall deliver the blessings on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Aval. So if we, once again, that we come to Eretz Yisrael, and we deliver the blessings on Mount Gerizim, the curse on Mount Aval, and this is actually explained later in Parsha's Kisavo. It goes into detail about what these blessings and curses were. But it says that it's going to be given in Mount Gerizim and Mount Aval, and it gives their location in verse 30. Are they not on the other side of the Jordan, far in the direction of the sunset, in the lands of the Canaanite that dwell in the plain far from the Gilgal near the plain of Moreh? And this is near the city of Shechem. And Rav Hirsch points out that Mount Gerizim, where it says we give the blessings and the curses that we give on Mount Aval, there are two mountains that are right next to each other. And we'll see later in Parsha Kisavo that the Levites would stand in the middle, in between the two blessings, and they'd face Mount Gerizim, and they invoke the blessings of Hashem for one who did the mitzvahs, and then they'd face Mount Aval and pronounce the curses. And Mount Gerizim was a very flourishing mountain full of greenery, and Mount Aval was completely desolate. It was completely bare of any kind of growth. And the verse says that this was to show that when it comes to Hashem's blessings and Hashem's curses, it's not about the potential that something has. That it's not that a person's born very bright and very talented or with lots of wealth, that they have blessing, and you have somebody would seemingly not have the same kind of potential, so that person doesn't flourish. But that's not the way it works, because these are two mountains that are right next to each other. They're right across a valley from each other, and one is flourishing and one is desolate. And that just goes to show that the blessing is where Hashem chooses should be blessed. That's where blessing sits, and where Hashem chooses should be cursed. That's where things are desolate. So moving on, and the bottom of page 999 in the Art Scroll, Parshas Re'eh, chapter 12, verse 1. These are the decrees and the ordinances that you shall observe to perform in the land that Hashem, the God of your forefathers, has given you to possess it, all the days that you live in the land. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations that you are driving away worship their gods, in page 1001, on the high mountains and the hills and under every leafy tree. You shall break apart their altars, you shall smash their pillars and their sacred trees, you shall burn in fire. The carved images shall you cut down, and you shall obliterate their names from that place. So we discussed this last week that we criticize, we see news stories about ISIS, how they would completely destroy these historic archaeological wonders that were thousands of years old, these old ancient temples. That was our mitzvah when we came into the land of Israel, and it was something that we did not fulfill the way we should have, because it's something difficult. But we were commanded to destroy all the temples of the people of the land. And it continues in verse 4, you shall not do this to Hashem your God. And we'll discuss what that means exactly. But it says that we're supposed to destroy all the places where they worship their idols, and their temples and idols we should destroy. Do not do this to Hashem your God. Rather, only at the place that Hashem your God will choose from among your tribes, the place of his name, shall you seek out his presence and come there. And there you shall bring your elevation offerings and feast offerings, your tithes, and what you raise up with your hands, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your cattle and your flocks. You shall eat there before Hashem your God, you shall rejoice, etc. So what does that mean? We have to break apart their stuff, but you shall not do that to Hashem your God. You would think that's obvious. It's telling us we have to destroy all the idolatrous places, all their temples and idols, but don't do that to Shul. Don't do that to the Beis Hamikdash, to the holy temple. You would think that would be obvious. And our sages say that, in fact, the Gemara says that this is a prohibition to erase the name of Hashem. That we're supposed to erase the presence of any pagan, idolatrous temple, but not to Hashem, meaning we cannot erase the name of Hashem. And in modern times, this actually makes problems because, usually we're not sitting there erasing Hashem's name. It would mean that if we're writing a verse on a whiteboard or something, or a chalkboard, that we shouldn't write out the actual name of Hashem, because then there would be a prohibition against erasing it. But with modern technology, the question has come up that if somebody has on their computer that they have, or nowadays a cell phone, let's say they have a siddur on their phone, and they have the name of Hashem, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, are they allowed to erase that? Or are they allowed to turn it off or swipe to the next screen where they have the name of Hashem written out there, and then they swipe? So the Paiskim, halachically, they came out that on a screen, on a phone screen or a computer screen, it's not really written there. There's nothing real there because it's just a bunch of pixels, a bunch of dots of light that are very close together. So it's not considered like an actual written name of Hashem, that there would be a prohibition against erasing. But that's that's with a screen, whatever kind of screen it is. But I guess they're not really common nowadays. But back when they had the Nooks and the Kindles, that actually, not the Kindle Fire, not the tablet, but it was more of like a book reader. Those actually had, they didn't use pixels, and they actually had some kind of ink that was brought together under the screen, and it actually read like a book. It was great. So those actually could be problematic, and some hold that if we actually have the name of Hashem on there, we can't turn it off. We'd have to leave it until it went off by itself, and try not to get it back on. So having a siddur on one of those would be problematic if it has the name of it. So that's one explanation of this. You shall not do this to Hashem your God means you shall not erase the name of Hashem. That's what the Gemara says. The Medrash though says is that we do have some control. It might be obvious to us that we can't actually destroy the holy temple, destroy a shul by hand, but it says that we have some control over what happens in the world, that when we follow the Torah properly, so our souls are protected. There are times that the Torah says many times that if we sin and we follow idolatry and do other things that are mentioned by the prophets, so the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, will be destroyed. And that's what the Torah is telling us. Do not act in a way that will bring about the destruction of our holy places. But the Klei Yakar has a beautiful thought about this whole section of this whole section of the Torah, and that is that in the mitzvah to destroy the idolatrous temples, the way it's given is in verse 2. This is the bottom of 999. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations that you are driving away worship their gods. So it's saying, it's focusing on the places. You shall destroy the places that they worship their gods. On the high mountains, the hills, under every leafy tree, it's describing a location that they worship. And he explains why is that. He says that their gods, they really did not have any power. There was and there so when they chose the place for a temple, it wasn't where that deity, that pagan deity, dictated. They chose a place that was inspiring. They chose the high place. They chose a hill. They chose a mountain, the top of a mountain, or under a big tree that was something that looked like a place of power. And that's a powerful place. That's where they built their temples. And that's because that their deity did not have power. So it wasn't the deity that made the place holy. To them, it was the opposite. It was the place that was holy, and that's where they put their temples, in a holy place. But the pre-existing condition was that the place had to be holy. It had to be the top of a mountain under a big tree where they built their temple. And that's where it continues in verse 4. You shall not do this to Hashem your God. The Koyach understands. That means that we do not choose an inspiring place to build a temple for Hashem. We don't look around and say, whoa, this is a very, this is a very beautiful area and it's very awe-inspiring and it feels holy. That's where we're going to build it. That's not how we do. Rather, in verse 5, only at the place that Hashem your God will choose from among all your tribes to place his name shall you seek out his presence and come there. That we don't build the temple where we feel inspired and where we feel is holy. We build the temple where Hashem tells us to build the temple. And the reason for that, where Hashem chooses to rest his presence, that's where we build the temple, because it's not the holy place. It's not the place that Hashem rests because it's holy. It's Hashem resting in the place that makes the place holy. And he kind of hints at this in the Das, that's where Moshe Sternbach actually elaborates a little more from the Kli Yakar, is that the way it's described here is that, where is it? You seek out his presence, shall you seek out his presence and come there, in verse 5. That we have to seek out Hashem's presence and come there. And he points out that it doesn't actually tell us where that is. And the Medrash says that King Shaul and after him, David HaMelech, King David, they were themselves not sure where this place was that the Beis HaMikdash should be built. And there was David HaMelech, King David happened to be on the Temple Mount, and he realized that he received a divine message that this was the place. But they didn't know that. And we find even elsewhere as well with Avraham, where he was told to bring his son Yitzchak to offer his son Yitzchak. And Hashem told him that take him to the place that I will show you, which ended up being Har Moriah, Mount Moriah, by the Temple Mount. But he didn't tell him in advance where it was. He said, take him to the place that I will show you. It doesn't tell us that the Temple Mount is not somewhere that's like preordained that this is a holy place. And the Torah doesn't even tell us where it is. And it's something we have to seek. As it says, you have to search for it. And Moshe Sternbach explains that this is really a message for us, and it's the reason for this is that holiness is not always obvious. It's not something it's not so cut and dry and black and white that this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, and that's all there is to it. Finding the Shekhinah, finding the divine presence is something. It's a task. It's a journey. And it's something that we have to seek out, we have to search for it, we have to work at it. And it's never easy. And that's as it says, that we have to seek out the place where Hashem rests his presence. It's a lifetime endeavor it's a lifetime search to find what our place in, where our place in the service of Hashem is. Okay, so now moving on. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Where am I? I'm going to skip a little bit. This is a little complicated. So I'm going to skip to page 1005, verse 20, page 1005 in the Article Siddur, chapter 12, verse 20. And it states, when Hashem your God will broaden your boundary as he spoke to you, and you say, I would eat meat, for you will have a desire to eat meat. Your heart's desire may you eat meat. And if the place that Hashem your God will choose to place his name will be far from you, you may slaughter from your cattle your flocks that Hashem has given you as I have commanded you. You shall eat in your cities according to your heart's entire desire. You could eat meat wherever you happen to be. Even as the deer and the hart are eaten, so you may eat it. The contaminated ones and the pure ones may eat it together. And in verse 23, only be strong, not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life. You shall not eat the life with the meat. You shall not eat it, you shall pour it onto the ground like water. You shall not eat it in order that it be well with you and your children after you, when you do what is right in the eyes of Hashem. Okay, so there's a lot here going on. It begins that when Hashem broadens your boundaries. Remember, at this point in time, when they got this mitzvah, they were in the desert and all encamped around the Mishkan. They were all in one small area, encamped around the Mishkan. And at that time, the time that they were in the desert, they were not allowed to eat domesticated animals or birds, any animal that could be brought as an offering. They weren't allowed to eat it just to eat. Birds, actually, strike that one. But domesticated animals, they weren't cows, sheep, goats. They weren't allowed to eat just because they were hungry, just because they wanted to eat it. They could only eat it if they brought it as an offering, as a peace offering in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. Here, as the Ramban understands, the Torah is telling us that when Hashem broadens their boundaries, when they go into the land of Israel, they could be many miles away from the temple, and it would be very difficult for them to bring an offering anytime they wanted to have meat. And here, the Torah is telling them that once they get into the land of Israel, at that point, it would be permitted for them to eat meat, even not in the context of it being an offering. And that's what it says, that the pure and the impure could eat together, because at the time of the desert, since the only meat they were allowed to eat was meat of an offering, so the impure could not eat that, because it's prohibited for an impure person to eat the meat of an offering. But once they're in the land of Israel, so then they could just slaughter on their own and eat it. So a few things about this, though. It gives us some of the laws of kosher right here. It says that, where am I here? It says in verse 21, you may slaughter from your cattle and your flocks that Hashem has given you as I have commanded you. This is the mitzvah of shchita, of slaughtering, the way that we slaughter the animals before we eat them. And this is with any animal or bird. We have to slaughter it properly before we eat it. So how is that done? And we've spoken about this before, that the shochet has to take a very, very sharp knife. It has to be completely free of any imperfections in the blade. The blade has to be perfectly straight edge without any imperfections. And the shochet would move it back and forth over and sever the windpipe and the esophagus. So the trachea and the esophagus, and that is the slaughtering that would make it kosher. It's a kosher slaughtering. And it continues that only be strong not to eat the blood. We're prohibited from eating the blood of an animal, and that means that we have to remove the blood before we eat it. Interestingly, if we would grill the meat, we would not need to remove the blood, because grilling itself the heat of the fire draws the blood out of the meat. And if the meat is grilled fully, so it's kosher without any additional koshering. But if we're going to cook it in any other way, so we would need to kosher it. And how would it be koshered? So we would soak it in water, and then we salt it and completely cover it with salt, and leave the salt on the meat for, I think it's half an hour, maybe an hour. I'm confusing the soaking and salting. One's half an hour, one's an hour. And then rinse it off, and then at that point it is kosher, and you could cook it in a soup, you could cook it in a stew, however you want to cook it. But at that point the meat is kosher because the blood is taken out through the salt. Okay, then it continues in verse 24. You shall not eat it, referring to the blood. You shall pour it on the ground like water. So where am I? Okay, so we pour the blood on the ground, and moving on. And on page 1007, verse 29, it continues, when Hashem your God will cut down the nations where you come to drive them away before you, and you drive them away and settle in their land, Beware for yourself, lest you be attracted after them, after they have been destroyed before you, unless you seek out the gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods? And even I will do the same. You shall not do so to Hashem your God, for everything that is an abomination of Hashem that he hates have they done to their gods. Even their sons and daughters have they burned in the fire of their gods. Now the Ramban understands this. This is a prohibition. We're prohibited from looking at the idolatrous pagan nations of the land of Canaan and imitating their form of worship. So seeing, and even if we're doing it to worship Hashem, for example, you see that some of them may, I don't want to just start thinking about, well, however they would worship their gods, we can't imitate their service in order to serve Hashem. So if we see that something is done in a pagan temple and say, oh, that's beautiful, that looks so spiritual, let's adopt that and do it in our shul to honor Hashem. So that is prohibited by this verse. That, like, lest you see how they worship their gods and say, let's adopt this for our service of Hashem. And as it continues, if you look at what they did in the land, they went so far as to offer up their sons and daughters and human sacrifice, which is obviously something that is not wanted by Hashem. Okay, then it continues in chapter 13, verse 1. The entire word that I command you, you shall observe to do, you shall not add to it, you shall not subtract from it. And according to the Ramban, this is a continuation of before. Don't adopt the customs, don't adopt the worship of other religions for our own service of Hashem. And for the Torah is perfect, we're not allowed to add to it, and we're not allowed to subtract it from it. Subtracting is obvious. We can't just get rid of a mitzvah because we don't like it. But adding to a mitzvah is also something that's prohibited, and the commentaries explain that when you have, let's say, a perfect painting, so if a person adds to it, they're not really adding. They add an element to it, even if they add something beautiful. If it was perfect before, whatever you add is throwing it out of balance. Something that's perfect is perfectly balanced. And when you add to it, you're actually subtracting. And so therefore it's prohibited to add to the Torah. And to be clear, to add to the Torah does not include the prohibitions that the rabbis added, which we might discuss a little later when it comes to kosher. But that the rabbis added is the wrong word, but the rabbis enacted, sages of the Mishnah and the Gemara enacted, in order to protect the mitzvahs. That is in the Torah, it says that we have to guard the mitzvahs. That means that we have to, as the Mishnah says, erect fences around the mitzvahs, meaning to distance ourselves to ensure that we don't violate it, but it has to be clear the reason why we're doing it. That when something's rabbinically prohibited in order to protect another mitzvah, for example, we'll see later in the Parsha, there's a prohibition against eating meat with milk. And the rabbis of the Mishnah said that chicken and milk is also prohibited. Bird meat and milk, even though technically bird meat is not included in the Torah prohibition, but they prohibited it because if one gets used to eating bird meat with milk, they could slip and eat meat with milk too. And that was enacted in order to protect the mitzvah, but it has to be clear that the reason why it was enacted to protect the mitzvah and that it isn't a mitzvah in and of itself. Okay. Okay, then it continues a false prophet, that if a prophet gets up and tells us to follow another deity, so don't follow him, even if he comes with signs, wonders. If he's telling us to abandon Hashem and worship idols, don't follow him, and that prophet is put to death. Then it talks about one who entices others to go astray. If someone is missionizing pagan religions amongst the Jews, this is on page 1009, verse 7, and they tell you to let's go worship gods of others. So that person is also put to death if he tries to convince people to worship idols. And on the bottom of page 1009, verse 13, it says, if in one of your cities that Hashem your God gives you in which to dwell, you hear saying, lawless men have emerged from your midst. They have caused the dwellers of their city to go astray, saying, let us go and worship the gods of others. So now you have a city that the entire city is worshiping idols. You should, in verse 15 on page 1011, you shall seek out and investigate and inquire well, and behold, it is true. The word is correct. This abomination was committed in your midst. You shall smite the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, lay it waste, and everything that is in it, and its animals with the edge of the sword. You shall gather together all of its booty, all the spoils of the battle to the midst of the open square. You shall burn and fire completely the city and all its booty to Hashem your God. It shall be an eternal heap, it shall not be rebuilt. And no part of the banned property may adhere to your hand, so that Hashem will turn back from his burning wrath, and he will give you mercy and be merciful to you and multiply you, as he swore to your forefathers when you hearken to the word and voice of Hashem your God, to observe all his commandments I command you today, to do what is right in the eyes of Hashem your God. So if you have a city that everyone's worshiping idols, so they would be commanded to wipe out the city, burn it to the ground, and never rebuild it. And just as an aside, the Gemara says that if there's one mezuzah in the whole city, then the city would not be burnt down, because it says that you have to bring everything into the middle of the city and burn it, but we're not allowed to burn a mezuzah or anything holy as a Torah scroll, a mezuzah, tefillin, something of that nature. So if there's just one of them in the whole city, that would save this city from all this from being carried out in the city. Additionally, it says in verse 18, it says, and he will give you mercy and be merciful to you. So be merciful to you, we understand. What does it mean that he will give you mercy? So the commentaries say that doing something like this, all this killing, especially like wiping out an entire city, is very dangerous to our own nature. That the people who are carrying that out would be concerned that just doing that, just committing these acts of violence, would make them a more violent person, would make them a more cruel person, because they have to shut their ears to the pleas of those that they're killing and kill them. So the Torah is telling us that Hashem will grant them mercy, meaning that naturally that's correct. And the Torah is saying that there will be a special blessing, that these people will remain merciful and not be affected by this violence to become cruel. Okay, so now on page 1011, verse 1, chapter 14, verse 1. You are children to Hashem your God. You shall not cut yourself and not make a bald spot between your eyes for a dead person. This is something that pagans did. You see pictures of witch doctors, etc., pagan practitioners that like they would make cuts all over themselves, and in mourning. That's prohibited for us. We're children to Hashem. We're like princes, where it's not appropriate to be seen in an undignified manner like that. And it continues in verse 2, for you are a holy people to Hashem your God, and Hashem has chosen you for himself. Be a treasured people from among all the people on the face of the earth. And now we get into the laws of kosher. So it states, you shall not eat any abomination. These are the animals that you may eat. The ox, the sheep, and the goat on page 1013. The hart, the deer, and the yachmar, the akadish, and the tail of the zamer. And then that's some animals, a list of animals, but then it gives the general rule. And any animal that has split hoof, which is completely separated into two hoofs, that brings up its cut among the animals, that you may eat. So that's how any land animal has to have these two conditions, that it has split hooves. That means that its hoof is split completely in half, two toes, and it chews its cud, meaning that it chews up its food, swallows it, and that food goes into one's stomach and gets digested in that stomach, and then it regurgitates the food after it's partially digested. It chews some more, then goes into another stomach, and has a whole series of stomachs. That is an animal that chews its cud. Those, as long as it has split hooves, chews its cud, that's a kosher animal. And it continues, but this that you may not eat from among those that bring up their cud or have a completely separated split hoof, the camel, the hare, and the hyrax, they bring up their cud, but their hoof is not split, they are unclean for you. So these animals do chew their cud, they do eat, regurgitate, and eat some more. Or I should say, and eat that food again. And it goes through a series of stomachs, but they do not have split hooves, so they're not kosher. And the pig, for it is a split hoof, but not the cud. So a pig has split hooves, as you can see, but it does not chew its cud. It doesn't, once again, regurgitate and move through multiple stomachs. So it is unclean to you. From their flesh you shall not eat, you shall not touch their carcasses. Okay, so that's land animals. And so that includes lots of animals. That would include a sheep, goat, cow, deer, even giraffes have split hooves and they chew their cud. That includes many domesticated animals and many wild animals as well. Bison are kosher. Then in verse 9, this you may eat of anything that is in the water, anything that is fins or scales you may eat, and anything that does not have fins or scales you shall not eat, it is unclean to you. So the Torah says anything that has fins and scales. The Gemara says that anything that has scales, you could assume had fins also, and those you could eat. And the commentaries, the Ramban especially, defines a scale as a scale that you could pull off. It's separate from the body of the fish, that you could pull it off the skin without tearing the skin. And this is a very useful halacha, because whereas other things, especially when it comes to animals and birds, they have to be shafted properly. So basically, you really can't buy any kind of meat without a hechsher, without it being certified as kosher. Whereas with fish, since they don't need to be slaughtered, they don't have to have the blood removed. A fish you could buy as long as you know that the fish is kosher. And how do you know that the fish is kosher? If you can see the skin on the fish and see attached to the fish, I should say, attached to whatever the fillet is, and see that it has scales. Once again, a scale that if you could pull off one scale without breaking the skin, so that fish is kosher. The issue would be that it might have, especially if you buy it from a fish store, so they might share knives between filleting different fish, and they might use the knife for a catfish, which is a non-kosher fish, and then use it for not clean it very well and use it for a kosher fish. And then when you buy that fillet, that it has the fats of it has the fish fat from the catfish on that fillet of halibut or whatever kosher fish you want to eat. So the best way to do it is, if you're buying these to go into a fish store with your own fillet knife that is kosher, and maybe even your own cutting board might be a problem. If they use paper, and they could put down new paper before they cut your fish, so then you could know that they're using your knife, which is kosher. And as long as you can see the scales on the fish, so then it's kosher. But otherwise, talk to a rabbi, because there might be ways he might allow. If there are any other issues, just to buy let's say I see in Sam's sometimes they have these big fillets of salmon and with skin on, so you could see the scales. So in that case, there may be some ways to ensure to get the fat off. Talk to a halachic authority about that. Okay, so now every clean bird. So in verse 11 about the birds, the Torah gives a list of birds that are not kosher. Because of this, and we don't know what each of these birds are, we don't know how to translate each of them. So the halacha at this point is that we will not eat any bird that we do not have a tradition that it was eaten by Jewish communities. So, and there have actually been some major disputes in America about some birds. A turkey, actually, there was a big dispute about a turkey, because a turkey was a New World bird, and it would seem that there shouldn't have been a tradition that it was kosher, but somehow a tradition developed that the turkey was kosher. But there was another bird, I think it was a guinea hen, that there were some very strong disputes in the 1800s in America. And I think even the first rabbi of Bnei B'rith Jacob, I mentioned this before, but from some articles I read, the first rabbi of Bnei B'rith Jacob, Rabbi Jacob Rosenfeld, maybe, I don't remember. So he was involved in a big dispute when he was in a different city. He was a rabbi in a different city. He was involved in a big dispute about the kashrus of certain birds in America, and the questions were sent to the great rabbis of Europe, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Rav Nassim Adler in London. There were questions sent to Rav Shlomo Kluger, some of the great halachic authorities of Europe, about the kashrus of these American birds. But there are some who to this day will not eat turkey, because like I said, it's questionable how the tradition developed that it's kosher, but the vast majority of Jews do have the custom of eating turkey. Okay, so moving on. In verse 19 on page 1013, and every flying, swarming creature is unclean to you, they shall not be eaten, and every clean bird may you eat. You shall not eat any carcass, that means anything that died of any other means other than kosher slaughtering. To the stranger who is in your cities, you shall give it, that he may eat it or sell it to Gentile, for you are holy people to Hashem your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And this is the source of the prohibition against eating milk and meat, that can't cook a kid, meaning a baby goat, in the milk of its mother, meaning an animal that would produce milk, that the mothers produce milk. You can't mix the milk with the meat. Or as the Torah says here, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it actually has that mitzvah 3 times in the Torah, and the Mishnah states that those 3 times are to teach us that there are 3 set prohibitions when it comes to milk and meat. It's prohibited to cook the milk and meat, it's prohibited to derive benefit from the mixture of milk and meat, and it's prohibited to eat the mixture of milk and meat. But it's written as a prohibition to cook, but in all 3, because this prohibition to eat is only biblically prohibited if they're cooked together. So as far as the biblical law is concerned, one is allowed to, let's say, take a hamburger, cook it, put a slice of cheese on, and eat it, as long as it's not cooked. The 2 are not cooked together. But like we mentioned, rabbinically speaking, that's prohibited, and that's once again a safeguard, so people won't get used to eating milk and meat together, and they may slip and cook it together and eat it. And Rosh Hashanah comments on like the stringencies that we see with milk and meat, that not only did they say that we can't eat it together, but we can't eat it together even if it's not cooked, but they prohibited chicken and milk together, and they even prohibited eating milk immediately after meat, that their custom is to wait an extended length of time, however long that is, in between the milk and the meat. And Rav Shimon Schwab says the reason for that is why there's so many stringencies when it comes to the laws of kosher, especially the laws of eating milk and meat together, is from this verse 21, where it says, "For you are a holy people to Hashem your God, who shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." That since it invokes this mitzvah in regard to our holiness, it's saying that the Torah seems to be saying this is what makes us holy, that we do not eat that, so we're very stringent, we're very careful when it comes to that mitzvah. Okay, then in verse 22, on the bottom of 10:13, you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field year by year. Then we take 1/10 and give it to the Levi. And then it continues, and you shall eat it before Hashem your God in the place that you will choose to rest his name. So I mentioned that I just said that you take 1/10, give it to the Levi. That's called the first tithe. There's another tithe, which is referred to here, the second tithe, which we would take to the land to Yerushalayim and eat it in the city of Yerushalayim. That is called the second tithe, and that's what it's referred to here in verse 23 on page 1015. You shall eat it before Hashem your God in the place that you will choose to rest his name. Tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil, the firstborn of your cattle, flocks, so that you will learn to fear Hashem your God all the days. And then it continues in verse 24, if the road will be too long for you so that you'll not carry it, because the place that Hashem your God will choose to place his name there is far from you. You can imagine if a person lives at the opposite end of Israel from Yerushalayim, it's a long journey to get from there to Yerushalayim, especially without modern transportation, and it may spoil along the way, or it'll be incredibly difficult to make that journey with so much if the person was blessed with a big harvest. So the Torah says, then you may exchange it for money, wrap up the money in your hand, and go to the place that Hashem your God will choose. So we could transfer the holiness from that tithe to the money, take the money to Yerushalayim, and buy food there and eat it in Yerushalayim with the holiness of the second tithe. Okay. And in verse 28, at the end of 3 years, you shall take out every tithe of your crops in that year and set it down within your cities. Then the Levite can come, for he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the proselyte or from the widow who are in your cities. So they may eat, be satisfied, in order that Hashem your God will bless you in all your handiwork that you may undertake. So here it's telling us that and we spoke about the second tithe that was taken to Yerushalayim and eaten there. Now it's saying in the third year of the Shemitah cycle, and in the sixth year as well of the Shemitah, the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. So instead of taking that second tithe and bringing it to Yerushalayim and eating it there, so it would be kept in your city. You would take that second tithe, but it would be given to the poor, as it says, to the Levi, to the orphan, the widow, to the destitute. So they would have what to eat. And this is in the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. Then, speaking of Shemitah, on chapter 15, verse 1, at the end of the 7 years, you shall institute a remission. This is the matter of the remission. What does that mean? Remission, something stops. What stops? Every creditor shall remit his authority over what he has lent to his fellow. He shall not press his fellow, his brother, for he has proclaimed a remission for Hashem. You may press the Gentile, but over what you have with your brother, you shall remit your authority. Meaning that we are not allowed to collect loans. If someone owes us money, once the Shemitah comes, we are not allowed to collect that loan from our brother, from our fellow Jew. A non-Jew owes us money, we could collect it after the Shemitah year, but not if a Jew owes us money. We're not allowed to collect the money. However, may there be no destitute among you. Rather, Hashem will surely bless you in the land that Hashem your God gives you as inheritance to possess it, etc. For Hashem your God has blessed you, as he has told you, you will lend to many nations, you will not borrow, you will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you if we follow the will of Hashem. And then we have the mitzvah of tzedakah, and I'll come back to that. But in verse 9, on page 1017, it says, beware lest there be a lawless thought in your heart, saying the seventh year approaches, the remission year. You will look malevolently upon your destitute brother and refuse to give him. Then he may appeal against you to Hashem, and it will be a sin upon you. You will surely give him. Let your heart not feel bad when you give him. In return for this matter, Hashem your God will bless you in all your deeds and in every undertaking. So the commentaries ask, I saw this from Moshe Sternbach asks, that we're talking about a loan here. Obviously, we're talking about a loan. Someone borrowed money because we're talking about the repayment being canceled or not being able to collect because of the Shemitah year. So how could the Torah tell us that lest there be a lawless thought in your heart, saying the seventh year approaches, you will look malevolently and not lend money? If you're lending money in the right before the Shemitah year, knowing that you'll not be able to collect the loan, that is not a loan. That's a gift. That's charity. But we're not talking about charity. We're talking about a loan. So obviously we have to give charity, but in the context of a loan, how can the Torah say that don't refrain from lending money in a way that you won't be able to collect the money? If we won't be able to collect the money, so it's, well, like we said, it's not a loan. And we talked about that last week, that there's nothing wrong with lending money in a way that you'll be able to get the money back. That's a mitzvah, in fact, not just. So he quotes the Rambam, is that this is not talking about lending the money where the period of the repayment would be after the Shemitah year. He said that would be foolish. That's not a loan, that's a gift. Rather, we're talking about a case where the terms of the loan, the person is obligated to repay before the Shemitah year, before the loan would be canceled, or before that this would kick in, that you wouldn't be able to collect. And this person is worried that the borrower may be delayed in paying, and eventually it'll come the Shemitah year, and then after that he won't be able to collect. And in that case, that's what the Torah is telling him, don't worry so much. And you do your hishtadlus, as we say, you do your part, you lend the money with witnesses, with a contract, maybe even take collateral, make sure that you have a lien on some real property that will be more collectible. But at the same time, it's saying you take care of that, but don't worry so much, and especially don't refrain from lending money because you're worried that the person will be late paying and the Shemitah year will come and cancel the debt. It says that's Hashem's business. And in fact, the Gemara says that unfortunately, this is an area that the Jewish people failed in. And our sages saw that people were not lending money close to the Shemitah year because they were afraid that they wouldn't get repaid. And that's why the Gemara says in Gittin that Hillel instituted a prosbul. He instituted that people should follow a loophole around the cancellation of collection. And that is that an individual is not allowed to collect the loan, but if a person delegates the loan to the court before this kicks in, the court is able to collect. And that's why on Shemitah year, this is something, a service that the Kollel does here in Savannah, is that we set up prosbos, which is a document that any loans that you have are given into the hands of the court, and the Jewish court, authorizes you to collect. And this is a loophole that Hillel authorized and set up around the cancellation of the loans, because people were finding that, unfortunately, people were not following this mitzvah, and people were finding it difficult to borrow money or close to Shemitah time. Okay, and I skipped a little bit, so I'll go back to verse 7 on page 1017. It continues. Verse 7, if there shall be a destitute people among you, any of your brethren in any of your cities in the land that Hashem your God gives you, you shall not harden your heart or close your hand against your destitute brother. Rather, you shall open your hand to him. You shall lend him his requirement, whatever is lacking to him. So you should open your hand to him, give him charity, give him a gift, or if not a gift, lend him money. And as we spoke about, there's this you have this empty thought of like worrying about the Shemitah, you're canceling it. And then in verse 10, you shall surely give him, let your heart not feel bad when you give him. And it concludes verse 11, you shall surely open your hand to your brother, to your poor, to your destitute in your land. So I think it's the Kleyakar comments here that there's a lot of doubling of verbs when it comes to tzedakah, when it comes to giving charity. That it begins in verse 7 where it says, it's actually verse 8. Rather, you shall open your hand to him. The Hebrew there in Pasuk Ches verse 8 is Ki pasoach tiftach es yadcha. That literally means you shall open your hand to him. Then it says, still in verse 8, you shall lend him his requirement. The Hebrew that is v'ha'avet tavitenu. Again, it's doubled. You shall lend him, you shall lend him. And then in verse 10, it says, you shall surely give him. Pasuk here, the Hebrew is nasan titain. You shall give, you shall give. Again, the giving is doubled. And again, in Pasuk Yud verse 11, where it says, you shall surely open your hand, the Hebrew is, again, pasoch tiftach. You shall open, you shall open. So why is this all doubled? So Rashi comments on a lot of this. Rashi comments that it's trying to tell us that you have to give multiple times. Even, if a poor person comes and says, I need a meal, I'm starving, I need a meal, you give him a meal. He comes back the next day, I need a meal. Give him again. He comes out the next day, give him again. If a person is lacking, the fact that we gave him already isn't an excuse. If he has needs now, there's still a mitzvah to give him at this point. And the commentaries say that even one may think that it's a bigger mitzvah. Let's say if a person has $1,000 that they could give to charity, and they designate this as their charity, they move it into charity, however they do it, into their charity account, whatever it is. This money is designated to charity. So there are a lot of different ways that a person could give that money. They could give it in one lump sum. They could give $1,000 to one person. They could give 500 to two people, or they could give $1 to 1,000 people. So one may think that giving all of it at once, or a significant sum at once, is the best way of giving charity, because that way you have the biggest impact on a person. That if you give 1,000 people $1, that doesn't make such an impact on each person. Whereas if you give one person $1,000, that could be life-changing. But here the Torah is telling us that you give, meaning it's better to give multiple times than to give it once, to give everything at once. That's better if we have, like we said, if we have a certain amount that we're able to afford, a certain amount that we could give, it's better to give lesser amount, lots of times than to give all at once. And a big reason is that every time we give, it makes an impact on us. Like we said with the city that worshipped idols, that Hashem promises us mercy because acts of violence affect us and would naturally make us more cruel. Acts of generosity affect us also and make us more generous. That what we do affects who we are and affects how we feel inside. And if we give lots of people, that changes us to become a more generous person. That the giving itself, as long as we give with the right attitude, if we give with an attitude of I hate this, this is so disturbing. So in that case, it doesn't affect it. It's just the opposite. It gives us a negative feeling. But if we look at it as a mitzvah and an opportunity that this poor person just came, now I have an opportunity to give tzedakah, and if he's more decrepit and run down, so it's like a beautiful esrog, that this is a great tzedakah because you gave it to someone who really needed it. And if we go look at it with that attitude, so the more we give, the more times we give, the more of an impact it makes on us. And that's the best way to give tzedakah. And the thing is, the Klayaka who comments on this double language that it says you shall give, you shall give. Elsewhere it says that Hashem will bless you, he will bless you. And that is that there's really two aspects when it comes to tzedakah. That every time we give charity, when we give to those that are needy, we're giving with our hands, we're giving the money over, but we're also giving with our hearts. Like I said, that someone could give a significant amount with a really bad attitude. They could give an amount very begrudgingly, or a person could, even if they're only giving a small amount, they can't afford to give a large gift. But if they're giving a small amount, but give it in a generous spirit and with an attitude, like I said, of joy, of an opportunity for a mitzvah, an opportunity that thank God that I have the resources that I could help these people in need. So then they're not just giving with their hands, they're giving with their heart. And those are the two givings that the Torah is telling us. You shall give, you shall give. You shall open your hand, open your hand. And that's referring to the giving, the physical giving with the physical giving over of the money, but it's also the giving with our heart, and we're rewarded for both. We're rewarded for the giving and we're rewarded for the generosity that we're giving with. Okay, then we have a mitzvah on page 1019, when a Jewish bondsman leaves our service, whether it's the 6th year or the Jubilee year. So we have a mitzvah, we don't send him out empty-handed. Rather, we have to leave him some, like a bonus almost. We leave him, or what's the word they use in the business world when someone gets laid off, they give them a severance. They give them severance pay. That they give them, like, thank you. You worked here. You worked here, and now you're leaving, and maybe it's against the person's will. But at least here's some severance pay. Here's some money to find your place, maybe in a new job search, and as a thank you for what you contributed to the company. So the Torah says in verse 13. But when you send him away free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. Adorn him generously from your flocks, from your threshing floor, from your wine cellars, that Hashem your God has blessed you, so you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Hashem your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you regarding this matter today. When we left Egypt, Hashem granted us great wealth. And we have a mitzvah when our bondsman is leaving our service to grant him some severance, to set him up for his future life. And this is really the opposite of like when people are freed from jail. Let's say people are incarcerated, so they're incarcerated and they're stuck in jail, and then they're let out. What happens? They open the gates. Here, go on. You're off. Find your way in life. And maybe they learn some skills in jail, prison. Maybe not. But how are they gonna continue? With their life? How are they going to get set up for success later in life if you basically leave them maybe with a bus ticket? So, and probably the only people they have to go back with are their previous acquaintances, which is how they fell into conviction in the first place. So this slave, this Jewish bondsman, which in many cases was a thief who was caught and was not able to pay back for what he stole, so he's put into bond, he's put into service to pay it back. So we're commanded to leave him with something, with some severance, so he could find an honest life afterwards. Okay, then in verse 19, every firstborn male that is born in your cattle, your flocks, you shall sanctify to Hashem your God. You shall not work with the firstborn of your bull, nor shall you shear the firstborn of your flock. Before Hashem your God, you shall eat it year by year in a place that Hashem will choose, you or your household. And in verse 21, but if it shall have a blemish, in which case it can't be brought in as an offering, lameness or blindness or any serious blemish, you shall not slaughter it to Hashem your God. In your cities you shall eat it, the contaminated one, the pure one alike, like the deer of the heart. However, you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it into the ground like water. But here, so the Torah is saying that we would bring the firstborn animal to sanctify it to Hashem, it would be brought as an offering. And if it has a physical imperfection, a blemish, so then you would be able to eat it. You still can't work it or like take the shearings, but we would be able to eat it. So what do we do nowadays with the firstborn? We obviously can't bring it as an offering because we don't have the temple to bring it as an offering. So what we'd have to do is wait for it to get a blemish. We'd have to let it graze, mark this one as a firstborn, so we would know not to do any work with it. We would know not to shear it, and we'd have to wait till it grazed until it developed some kind of physical imperfection. We couldn't do it ourselves, but we'd have to wait till that happened. Then we could slaughter it and eat it. But obviously, this is prone to mistakes, that you could lose track of which one's the firstborn and maybe have it pull your plow by accident, or you lose track of which sheep is the firstborn and shear it, take all the wool, which once again is prohibited. So therefore, what the Shulchan Aruch says we should do these days is that we give a non-Jew, we'd either sell a portion of it, of the mother while it's pregnant, or the portion of the baby to a non-Jew. And since if we have a Jew and a non-Jew partners in an animal, so the firstborn is not consecrated. And so this is what we'd have to do. If we have a female, obviously an animal that we know it's pregnant with its firstborn, so they would sell a part of that to a non-Jew to make him a partner. It could be a small amount. It could be a very, very minor partner, but make him a partner in the animal, and therefore it would not be subject to these laws. And even though we usually don't try to avoid mitzvahs if we can, and here we have this beautiful mitzvah of the firstborn, but like I said, because it's prone to issues that we might make a mistake and do something prohibited with the firstborn until it gets a blemish. So that's what we do, we avoid it. And then the Parsha ends with the festivals, and this is very often read on the festivals. We have the mitzvah, on page 1021, you shall observe the month of springtime and perform a Pesach offering for Hashem your God in the month of springtime. So there are two things. We have the mitzvah of Pesach, and the Torah is telling us that Pesach has to take place in the spring. This is why, and this is really the source, that we add a month to the year when the seasons start getting out of whack. And that's the second Adar, which I believe this coming Adar will be a double Adar. There are 2 months of Adar. And that is done to ensure, as the Torah says, that Pesach will be in the spring. And the reason for this is that a lunar year you notice that a Jewish month usually has 29 or 30 days. A secular month will usually have 30 or 31 days. Besides February, a secular month will have 30 or 31 days. So 12 secular months is longer than 12 lunar months. The average lunar month is 29 point something. The average secular month is probably 30 point something. So every year you'd be losing about, the Jewish year is about 15 days shorter than a secular year. So after every few years is a leap year where they add an extra month, and that, like we said, ensures that Pesach ends up in the spring. And we have the mitzvah of eating matzah, not eating chametz, and eating the paschal lamb. And then the mitzvah of Shavuos. And in verse 9, 1023, verse 9, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself when the sickle is first put to the standing crop. To begin to count 7 weeks, that's from the second day of Pesach, when they would bring the Omer offering. Then you shall observe the festival of Shavuos for Hashem your God. And then in verse 13, we have the mitzvah of Sukkot. You shall make the festival of Sukkot for a 7-day period. When you gather in from your threshing floor and from your wine cellar, you shall rejoice on your festival, you and your son, your daughter, your slave, your maidservant, the Levite, the proselyte, the orphan, and the widow who are in your cities. A 7-day period shall you celebrate to Hashem your God. The place that Hashem your God will choose, for Hashem will have blessed you in all your crop, all your handiwork, and you will be completely joyous. And notice that it says the 7th day, and that's because there's an 8th day is mentioned elsewhere, is Shmini Atzeres. It's the 8th day. Simchas Torah is the 2nd day, which is actually considered a separate holiday from Sukkot. So it's not mentioned. So Sukkot is called the 7-day holiday, even though it has 8, and outside Israel, 9 days. And it concludes in verse 16, 3 times a year, all your males should appear before Hashem your God in the place that he will choose on the festival of Matzos, the festival of Shavuos, the festival of Sukkot. He shall not appear before Hashem empty-handed, everything according to what he can give, according to the blessing that Hashem your God gives you. And the Haftorah is the Haftorah for Rabbi is one of the Haftorahs of consolation, the 7 Haftorahs of consolation after Tisha B'Av. And that is I'm going to say so. It's as all of them are, it's from the book of Yeshaya, and beautiful consolation for the Jewish people.